Build Right is the educational division of Sparkbox, working to inspire and empower a web built right. For more information about Build Right or to have one of our workshops at your company or event, check out buildright.io. If you'd like to have Sparkbox help you make your web better, visit csparkbox.com. You're watching Karen McGrane's Build Right Maker Series on content strategy for mobile from August 27th of 2015. The Build Right Maker Series is brought to you by the folks at Sparkbox and these generous sponsors. DataYard, performance-driven cloud hosting for kick-ass websites and applications. Campaign Monitor, a simple and elegant email marketing software for business. Shopify, a hosted, theme-based e-commerce platform. Harvest, simple time tracking, professional invoicing, powerful reporting software. Additional thanks to our secondary and giveaway sponsors for their help in making the Build Right Maker Series possible.
I gave a workshop not unlike this at an event a while back, and at the end they gathered feedback from everybody in the audience, and they sent me my feedback, and the feedback included this line: could have done with less discussion on content strategy. Which, given that the session was called Content Strategy, I just have to tell you guys, if this is what you're hoping to get out of the day today, you're going to be really disappointed. So let me start off by, I want to talk a little bit about sort of like a values system, some like big principles that I think outline my approach to talking about how we think about content and how we think about the mobile web. And I think these four things sort of like illustrate my point of view around why this is so important. So the first one, this may sound super obvious, but it's seemingly not, is that your strategy, your approach to what you publish on mobile devices, what you publish on the mobile web, matters. I have spent a lot of time over the last, say, 5 years or so talking with organizations that seem to believe that the mobile web is entirely about, functional, transactional tasks. So, I'm going to build an app, and users are going to come, and they're going to do their banking on their app, and that's what mobile is for. And as I walk through the day-to-day, I'll share some data and some perspectives that show that, no, in fact, there is no mobile in the sense of it being a distinct use case or a transaction or a scenario that is separate from all the other things that people want to do on the web. And that all of the content-focused tasks that we do, the research, the searching, the browsing, all of that, all of those things that are grounded in us being able to quickly answer a question or find a piece of information that we need or conduct some comparison task, all of those things that are grounded in content are every bit as important, if not in some ways even more important, when we work on the mobile web. And so a second principle that I think a lot of people among us share is this idea that our goal for content on the mobile web is content parity, okay? So it's the idea that you should not be trying to serve a subset of content. You should not be trying to figure out, let's sit around and debate in a meeting what it is that a mobile user, a quote-unquote mobile user, might want that's different from what a desktop user wants, and then start trying to slice and dice and silo your content so that you're giving mobile users something less or something different. Now, this is a tough one for people to wrap their heads around. One of my goals as we talk through the day-to-day will be to explain why this is true and to kind of help you make the case if you need to make that case in your organization for why you shouldn't be treating mobile as if it's this separate subpar silo. But the truth is, for most organizations, the easiest, most straightforward, best way for them to think about publishing to mobile is to really start out by saying, would it be possible for us to just publish the same stuff to everybody? So, third principle, this is one that is very near and dear to my heart, and frankly, it's not just specific to mobile. It's not a strategy if you can't maintain it. So, a lot of people sign themselves up and I've seen this happen in my 20-year web career, I've seen this happen dozens of times, where people get all excited about the principles or the practices of some new thing. It's like, oh, let's build an app. An app sounds like an amazing thing to do. And then they turn around and it's like, oh, well, they have no plan for how they are actually going to manage and maintain that app over time. Or they build a separate mobile website, or they start dumping content onto their intranet. And the enthusiasm for creating something new and being like, wow, won't it be great when we have this thing, is not met with the same excitement when it comes time to manage and maintain that. And if there's one thing that I have seen time and time again, particularly on the mobile web, it's that organizations are struggling with limited resources, small budgets, teams that are already pushed to their limit, trying to keep up with the demands of the pace of change already. And so as they start adding and fragmenting their team's efforts across a variety of different silos, whether that's desktop web or mobile web or native apps or internal or external platforms, they realize that they simply do not have the resources and the time to keep up. And so whatever you can do to create the most maintainable solution, whatever you can do to really think long-term about how can we make sure we get the biggest bang for our buck in our efforts, that's what's going to pay off. Like, your enthusiasm for doing something new and cool needs to also be met with a really mature and respectful sense of what the long-term consequences of those decisions will be. And then finally, and I think this is the one that just genuinely informs so much of my belief about what's important on mobile and all of these new crazy platforms that people use, is that you don't get to decide what device somebody uses to go on the web. You don't get to decide what device somebody is supposed to use when they come to your website or when they interact with you. And at any time where you find yourself saying, well, why would anybody ever want to do that on their phone? You're missing the real message here, which is that, you know what? Somebody already probably does want to do that on their phone. Frankly, someone probably is already trying to do that on their phone. And your belief that, everybody is just like you, everybody has a laptop computer with a broadband connection, simply isn't borne out by the reality of how people use their devices and what sorts of access people have. And so for me, I think the idea, the message, that our goal should be to deliver the same information and services to everybody equally, regardless of device. I think that's a totally empowering and really exciting way to think about what it means to design for the web. I will tell you, I am a high-minded idealist about what goes on the mobile web. I really genuinely believe that for us to do our jobs right, we should be thinking about how to make the web as open and accessible and fluid and flexible for every user, for every device, for every context that someone should want to be able to use it on. So with that, let me give you a little bit of some data, some insights around what's going on in the mobile web today. My little state of the mobile web context. So the first one, and this should probably come as no surprise to everybody, is the idea that our use of mobile devices has grown exponentially. So I like this particular chart here, which shows that mobile usage varies by industry. And so if you compare things like smartphone and tablet share of visits, if you look at some of the more popular industries out there, so retail, travel and hospitality, media and entertainment, you are already seeing a majority of mobile use. So most of these industries are already seeing more than 50% of their usage coming in from mobile devices. And if you look at this number in orange here, which is the top 20, some of those are seeing not just half uses of mobile, but it's something getting closer to 80 or 90%. So the top 20% of publishers are already seeing more than 90% of their traffic coming in on mobile devices. This is astonishing. I mean, I think we all kind of know, people use their mobile devices, right? But when you actually look at the data and you realize that right now, today, mobile share of site visits is already over 50% for many of the top industries. Mobile share of site visits is already about 50% for most of the major social platforms, so Facebook and Twitter. Mobile-only usage on those platforms is now up to 30 or 40%. Mobile use of search is also right at about 50%. We haven't quite hit the tipping point yet where all of the major search engines, so Google and Yahoo and Bing, are up above 50%, but they're almost right there. And so when I look at something like this, when you're genuinely saying, for most industries, for most types of traffic, mobile now currently represents about half of the market. Are you spending half of your efforts trying to ensure that you provide a great experience to users, whatever device or platform they happen to be on? I mean, is that half of your attention? Too often, I see organizations that are still too fixated on the desktop website. And so when I say that, you might come in and go, oh, right, Karen, so this focus on mobile, this 50% growth in use of mobile devices must come at the expense of the desktop, right? Wrong. So our adoption of mobile devices, our increase in use of mobile has not in any way affected people's use of the desktop. So desktop use over the past 7 or 8 years has stayed roughly consistent. It's about 2.5 hours per day, but mobile use has skyrocketed. So now I would say that we spend about the same amount of time on mobile devices as we spend on desktop devices. Now, for me, I think this is such an important metric to show, because it says, sometimes people come in and they'll say, okay, Karen, well, if you're so hot on mobile, like, we should just start treating mobile as if it's a separate thing and screw the desktop, you know, we don't need to worry about that anymore. But no, in fact, mobile usage is not cannibalizing desktop use at all, or our use of the desktop hasn't changed. And so our strategy, an effective strategy for thinking about what should we be doing across all of these devices and platforms, is something that still needs to take desktop use into account. We may be using our mobile devices to substitute for print media, or family time, or exercise, or sleep, but we are not using those at the expense of desktop computers. If you like this data, look, I have another chart that says the same thing. I thought I would just share that too. What it basically shows is that our media consumption over time continues to grow. Our enthusiasm for all of these different devices and platforms shows no sign of waning. But we can't start thinking, or I guess a better way to put this is, we shouldn't be thinking about each of these different devices and platforms as being in competition. Or a healthier way to think about it is, what can we do to have a content strategy and a development strategy that allows us to support all of these different devices as equal as possible? So, given that we've gone out and we've bought all these new devices and platforms and we're using them constantly, what does that tell us about the device landscape that we're operating in? So I think this is probably, information or data that's pretty familiar to people. But as you might imagine, the halcyon days in which we could imagine that we were designing websites or designing for experiences where everybody would have essentially the same size of screen, where we could count on everybody coming in at the same sort of connection speed, where we would know that everybody had a keyboard and a mouse, those days are completely gone. So I think that one of the challenges that people have is understanding the sheer fragmentation that has happened to this marketplace. It's tempting to be like, oh, sure, but we have phones and tablets and desktop computers now, right? That's, but we can wrap our head around those three those three basic concepts of what those platforms are. Trouble is we can't. So right now on the marketplace today, there's nearly 20,000 unique Android devices out there, each of which have their own screen size, their own device capabilities, their own features, their own functionality. The idea that we could treat designing for and publishing to a landscape like this in the same way that we treated the web in over the last decade, where we assumed everybody had a 1024 monitor, simply doesn't hold up. Like, we need different ways of thinking about adapting to something that is this diverse, that is this complex, where we can't make assumptions about the type of device or the capabilities of the device that somebody's going to have in their hand. Similarly, the sheer diversity in the sizes of people's physical screens means that we've got to adopt more flexible and more fluid ways of thinking about the web. Like, we can't necessarily make assumptions about the size of someone's screen or be aiming design decisions as if we can pretend that we know what somebody's going to have on their hand. It also means that we can't necessarily make even assumptions about the type of device that somebody has. And I think that this is one of the hardest things when I'm working with corporations. One of the hardest things for people to wrap their heads around is that when you say, oh, well, what should we do for smartphone users? Or what should we do for tablet users? It's virtually impossible, nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, for us to accurately know what type of device somebody has in their hand when they're going online. So the physical screen size isn't going to tell you anything. The pixel density of the device is going to get in the way. So being able to tell the difference between, what's like a standard resolution device and what's a high-def device means that even picking up on that information isn't going to give you any real context about the size of somebody's screen or the type of device that they're using. And beyond that, making choices about trying to aim design decisions toward a particular device often winds up with us making flawed assumptions about what somebody has in their hand and serving an inappropriate or inadequate layout to somebody. So rather than trying to make assumptions and say, okay, here's what our smartphone experience is going to be, and here's what our tablet experience is going to be, and here's what our desktop experience is going to be, we wind up relying on flawed assumptions based on user agent detection or device detection. And unfortunately, those decisions don't wind up being particularly accurate. We're trying to make choices about what we should serve things to based on what we can glean from the user agent string in the browser, or trying to rely on proprietary device detection libraries to tell us what the size of device or the capabilities of the device are, wind up being really flawed, wind up resulting in really flawed decisions. Browsers, I hate to tell you this, are probably lying to you. And most people, when they think about what they're going to get back from the device over the internet, think that the device is going to come back and accurately tell them, like, hey, yeah, I'm an iPad and I have these capabilities, but it doesn't happen. Browser manufacturers are way ahead of you in terms of you being able to make assumptions about what capabilities or what type of device somebody has in their hand by relying on the user agent string. I like this quote here that the new Edge browser coming from Microsoft, is that device going to accurately reflect over the internet that its user agent string is this new browser that just came on the marketplace? No, of course it's not going to. It's going to lie to you and say that it's every other browser out there, because that's what's going to actually get more information, more websites to be sent to it.
Keep talking and I'll try to tweak.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me see what I got coming up next. So, as a result, I'm taking a little detour into responsive design land here, because I genuinely believe that a lot of the assumptions that people make about what you can do to aim your content or aim your services or aim your strategy at a particular device type or a particular class of device wind up being flawed. And they're flawed not just for strategic reasons, they are flawed for actual physical technical reasons. Having a content strategy for mobile that is designed to serve the same information, the same services, the same type of stuff to everybody, regardless of device, actually winds up being a much more effective and sustainable strategy. So, now some people might very reasonably say to me at this point, well, Karen, I mean, sure, it's technically difficult. I mean, you might come in and say, yeah, user agent detection, yeah, device detection, it can be a little wonky, but surely, if our goal is to create the best user experience possible, we should set our sights a little higher. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard and say, don't let those technical difficulties get in the way. Let's figure out how we can motor through those technical difficulties so that we can provide the best user experience possible. But here's the rub. Providing the best user experience possible also does not mean sending different information or different content to people on different devices. Users don't actually want that. So a study here that I have from Exact Target shows that when consumers were asked what they expected from the mobile web, 91% of people said that access to content any way they wanted it was the most important criterion for them when they were judging the success of a mobile website or a mobile experience. And beyond that, 83% of users said that they believed that being able to have a seamless experience across devices was important to them. That number went up to 87% when you looked at people who owned both a smartphone and a tablet. So as far as users, for what they say that they want, for them, having access to the content and information and services that they want on any device, on any platform, actually turns out to be, for them, the most important things that they're looking at when they're considering whether they think something works for them. Nope. Getting there. Look, there's a chart that says that. So yeah, I'll just reiterate this. 91% of customers, when they were asked to evaluate the success of a mobile brand or the success of a mobile experience, said that access to content any way they wanted it was the most important thing for them. And 83% of people said that a seamless experience across all of their devices was important to them. That number went up to, this number here, this 83%, went up to 87% when people had both a smartphone and a tablet. And I'm sure this is borne out for you too when you're interacting with mobile devices. The idea that you get different information or different content or different services when you are on your desktop compared to when you are on a mobile device is frustrating. Like, you go to your desktop and you look something up, and then you're out on the street later and you've got your phone in your hand and you try to go back and find that information and you can't get to it. It's incredibly frustrating. And the reason that's frustrating is that 90% of people say that they start a task on one device and then complete it on a different device. I worked this past year with Celebrity Cruises. So Celebrity is like a high-end cruise line. And I told them when I went in and talked with them about their publishing strategy and their content strategy, I was like, well, you should have a responsive website and you should be just serving the same stuff to everybody. And they were like, well, Karen, come on, we sell high-end cruises. This is, a purchase that's often $10,000 or $15,000 for somebody. And it's, a big, high consideration purchase that involves a lot of research and decision making. They're like, nobody gonna do that on their phone. And I was like, well, yeah, they probably will, but even if that's the case, that's not necessarily, just because somebody may not transact on their phone, isn't necessarily the only thing that somebody may wish to do on their phone. So Celebrity went out and they came back and they said, Karen, we found some data that said that 50% of our customers, that number again, starts their research process on their mobile device. 50%. And they said it was a huge eye-opener for them because they had thought that nobody would ever use their phone for that. And then they found out that half of their customers were getting a bad experience on their mobile device as they were beginning the research process, sort of beginning the dreaming process of where they were going to go on vacation. And they were missing the opportunity to catch people as part of that research process where they might want to show something to their spouse or be browsing through pictures on their phone while they're at lunch, kind of dreaming about their vacation. And they said, that was a huge opportunity for them to capture those sorts of research and analysis tasks, even if the primary goal was not for them to support transacting. Or more to the point, hey, if somebody wants to transact on their phone, go ahead and let them, but don't necessarily think that that is the sole purpose for which someone would use their phone. People may want to begin researching or analyzing or browsing for information and then transact in another channel or complete the task in another channel. Beyond that, this is one of my favorite statistics because there's this sense, and I still see it all the time, if people saying, well, people use their mobile devices when they're on the go, and so if I'm a retailer, my number one thing that I should be trying to optimize for is local use of that device. Or if I'm a travel company, the number one thing I should be optimizing for is, last-minute, short-term sales so that I'm capturing somebody at the moment when they need to get a hotel room. It turns out, and I'm sure this is borne out by your behavior too, people don't use their mobile devices exclusively when they're on the go. They use them on the couch, They use them in their rooms. They use them at their desk. I worked with a bank this past couple years ago, and the bank had put a huge amount of money into their mobile app. And their mobile app was fantastic, like easy, fun, super simple ways to transact. They were justifiably proud of their mobile app, and they were justifiably proud of the huge amount of adoption that they had on their mobile app. Like their mobile-only numbers were eye-popping. And so, as part of this, they were like, wow, we did such a good job on this. Like, we should go talk to some of our customers about, how this app fits into their life. And they went into the research with this idea, they had the busy mom persona. Everybody's got the busy mom persona. And they're like, busy mom is so happy with our app because we are saving her all of this valuable time. Like, she can now do her banking at the stoplight, and, we've cut valuable minutes out of her day. And so they went and talked to their customers, and they found out that every single one of them was using their mobile app at their desk while they were at work, within arm's reach of their desktop computer. And when they were like, hey, why are you doing your mobile banking this way? Everybody was like, because the phone's better, because I like it better, it's easier to use. So there's not this sense that mobile is always going to be more difficult to use, that mobile is always going to be a subpar experience compared to the desktop, and there isn't this sense that people are only going to use their mobile devices when they are opportunistically picking them up out of their pocket. In many cases, people are simply using their mobile device because it's the device that's closest at hand. They don't want to get up and walk over across the room to go to their desktop computer, and so they expect to have access to the information and services that they would get everywhere else. There really isn't a sense that user behavior dictates that they want you to give them a subset of information that they would only need when they're on the go. And then finally, this is one of my favorite statistics. It's this idea that there are mobile internet users. So there are people whose primary way of going online is through their mobile device. So 34% of people who say that they use the mobile web to go online say that that's the primary way they go online. 34%, that's more than a third of Americans. And I see this a lot, particularly in younger populations. So if you're dealing with teenagers or young adults, this number is well over 50%. If you're dealing with low-income populations, people who, think about it. It's like if you could not afford to have a desktop computer and a broadband connection and a mobile device, which one would you pick? I'd pick my phone. And I think that's true of just about everybody. And if you're dealing with populations of people who are on the go, people who work at jobs where they're not likely to have access to a desktop computer regularly, these numbers are incredibly high for people who say no. My mobile device is not my satellite device, it's my primary device. And I think even for people who, much like myself, who have a desktop computer, I've had a desktop computer for 20 years, I still rely on my mobile device, I would say, about half the time. So even for people who might have other ways of getting online, their mobile device is still about 50% of their browsing. And so it just suggests that we can't keep treating mobile devices as if they are some little silo where the best user experience is a focused, limited experience that's aimed only at on-the-go use or aimed only at simply transactional tasks. People want and need mobile devices that give them access to the full scope of everything on the internet, everything that can get on any website. And that's what I think, that's what really should underscore what a content strategy for mobile should be. So I'm going to talk through now 3 different approaches to how organizations think about publishing to the mobile web. Okay? So first one is responsive web design. You may have heard of it. The second is what's called adaptive. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time going into what adaptive solutions are, because I think it's a really important concept, and it's one that tends to be shrouded in a certain amount of confusion and mystery. And then the third one, everybody's favorite, is the M-dot strategy, which is also sometimes called a separate mobile website. So let me start here with what an M-dot is and kind of unpack a little bit more about what some of the limitations are for a content strategy where you are treating mobile as if it's a completely separate silo. So the reason that a separate mobile website is dangerous is that in general, you want to avoid creating multiple versions of your website. It's called forking, and it's a forking nightmare from a maintenance perspective. So if you fork your website into separate mobile and desktop versions, then you're stuck updating both every single time there's a change, okay? So even if someone can make the case that a separate mobile website is a better strategy from a performance perspective, or from an interaction design perspective, I certainly hear people trying to make that argument. It is not a better strategy from a content perspective, because as I have found the hard way in many, many situations, it is quite difficult, if not impossible, for most organizations to have a content management and publishing infrastructure that enables them to dynamically update and maintain their content across two very different platforms, two very different sets of templates, without having things break or without having to update things in multiple places. So this M-dot strategy, this idea of treating mobile as if it's a completely separate silo, is something that has been recommended by no less than our dear Jacob Nielsen. Now, I want to say, with all due respect, a huge amount of credibility for Jacob Nielsen. His fingerprints are all over the field of user experience. I mean, a 30 or 40-year history of research and analysis. And I have a degree in HCI, and it's like you go back 30, 40 years and look at some of the research that's been done, and it's all coming from Nielsen. So it's with a great deal of respect that I tell you that when you look at his strategy here, where he says to build a separate mobile website in which you cut features and content that are not core to the mobile use case and send users who need more information to the desktop website, I tell you, you should follow Mr. Nielsen's example here. If you do the exact opposite of everything that he's telling you, don't do this. I am also extremely pleased to inform you that the Nielsen Norman Group website just went responsive. So the reason that this doesn't work is that too much of this is sitting on what I like to call the myth of mobile context, okay? So it's like Kenneth Bowles here says, it looks like you're on the train. Would you like to show me might like me to show you the insultingly simplified mobile site? As I said, screen size is not context, okay? And too often, as I'll get into with some of the adaptive stuff, too often you see people thinking that they can make assumptions about the context of someone's use, what people want from their device, simply based on what they believe they can tell from the size of someone's screen. Like, oh, so I think somebody's on the go, and that means that they're going to want different information. But as the data I just talked through earlier shows, yes, people use their mobile devices when they are in the train station or when they are standing on a street corner, but they also use their mobile devices when they're at home or in the office. And so the idea that people are choosing a device to reflect the context of use is simply a flawed assumption. And so what this winds up with is that you see organizations building a separate mobile website that offers only a paltry subset of the features and content that you can get on the real website, the website that everybody cares about, the desktop website. I like this example from Allstate because it's like you're thinking, okay, let's build a separate mobile website. Let's focus just on the mobile context here. Let's really narrow down and focus in on what mobile users are going to need. What's the number one reason why somebody's going to go to the Allstate website from their phone? Say it again. They were just in an accident. So you're standing on the street, you're standing on the side of the road, your car was just hit, you pick up the Allstate phone, pick up your phone to go to Allstate. Is there anything here that tells you what to do if you've just been in an accident? So the idea that these separate mobile websites provide a better experience or can be, obviously there are flawed decisions that happen here, but the idea that we should, create a completely separate silo that has less stuff in it doesn't make sense. I like this example from Bank of America, because I can look at this from a content strategy perspective. And somebody went in and said, okay, yeah, we've got all this stuff on our desktop website here, 6 bullet points that explain what this particular credit card does. But we don't need all that on the mobile website. Look, we're just going to give them these 2 bullet points here. That's all anybody needs. Well, if all anybody needs is these 2 bullet points, why are you telling me all this other stuff on your desktop website? Or another way to look at that is, if what's on the desktop website is important, like, it's only 6 bullet points. I mean, what's the problem with taking those 6 bullet points and having somebody be able to read them on their phone? What they've signed themselves up for here is now having to manage and maintain 2 completely different versions of their website. And every time they want to make a change to their policies, their procedures, their disclosures, the percentage of cash you get back, they got to update it in 2 places. If I were one of the lawyers for Bank of America, I would have a conniption about this, because the idea that you might have what I'm confident is a hard-coded mobile website with no publishing system behind it, and that you might have information that is inaccurate in these different channels, that's a risk that I would not be willing to take if I were in legal and compliance. Ritz-Carlton is maintaining 2 completely separate versions of the directions to their properties. One on desktop and one on mobile. Why would you do that? Why? Well, the only reason that you're doing that is that you don't have the technical infrastructure to support having all of that content stored in one place and then dynamically published to two different channels. And so somewhere along the line, you had to get a completely separate feed of direction information for the properties that would feed into your mobile website or feed into your mobile app. And you can, it's like, I'm looking at this with my content strategy hat on, I'm like, well, this just seems like a really unnecessary waste of resources and time for people to actually have to manage and create and maintain 2 different versions of this. And the idea that when I say you don't get to decide what device somebody uses to go on the web, you don't get to decide what device somebody uses to go to your MDOT either. If you ever wound up looking at an MDOT site on your desktop computer and found that it's all just completely borked, that may not sound like the biggest problem that our society is facing today, but the problem is that it gets in the way of people being able to do these kinds of research and analysis tasks. So if I want to buy a car and I'm browsing and I want to take a link and send that to my spouse, or email it to myself, or look at it again when I get home, the idea that I'm sharing links around that doesn't provide a good experience just makes it harder on me. Now, these are surmountable problems, but the challenge is that, the idea is that if you fork your website like this, what you wind up doing is fragmenting your efforts, fragmenting your time, and you wind up with an approach that just isn't as good for people. Okay. Nope. So close.
So Karen, that personal experience is also driving away commitments to your brand, where I have personal experience where this is a resource that I've gone to frequently.
Yep.
And then I had gotten an Android tablet, and I would like to go to this resource websites frequently, and then when I went to the tablet, I was like, hey friend, let me show you this really cool thing, and I pull it up, and I can't get out of the MDOT. I keep getting forced back to the MDOT because it won't let me get to the desktop.
Yep.
So it's like, I can't show you what was really cool about them because they won't let me.
It's just why are you blocking me from being able to get to the information that I know is there? Yep.
They lost me.
Yep, exactly. I had a great story from the guy who runs the intranet at Citrix, and he said that when they kicked off their responsive internet project, he said, we had to do a lot of convincing of people who might reasonably say, yeah, okay, I get that the front-end website might need to be different, but the intranet, everybody's going to be using that on their desktop computer at the office. And he said, we told a story of one of our managers who, his wife was in the hospital, and he needed to get some insurance information immediately, and couldn't get to it on his phone while he was standing there in the hospital. And the manager came back, and they're like, why doesn't this work on my phone? And they were like, well, it's gonna now. So this idea that we can fragment our efforts just simply doesn't work. So if that's the case, let's talk through, in these 3 different models, let's talk through just a brief explanation of what I mean by responsive. And I'm not really here to give you the nuts and bolts of how a responsive design works. You will have Ethan Marcotte and many other fine people who can talk through that much better. I want to talk through it primarily from the lens of a content strategy. Okay? So responsive web design, the necessary and sufficient definition of a responsive design is fluid grids, flexible images, and media queries. I like emphasizing this point because you will notice that in this necessary and sufficient definition of what makes for a responsive design, there is not one word about the content, okay? And there is this sense that when people talk about responsive, that it means that you serve the exact same website in every situation to every user. And in one sense, I think that's an awesome thing, okay? I like the idea that a responsive solution is essentially adopting a value system that I like to call OneWeb, or that gets called OneWeb. So the W3C says that OneWeb means making, as far as is reasonable, the same information and services available to users, irrespective of the device that they're using. Now this, to me, from my high-minded idealism, I think is a really powerful concept. It's this idea that the web, in itself, as a medium, does not need to be fractured and fragmented and siloed to get it to work on different devices or different contexts, okay? The web, if we do the web the way the web wants to be done, it will be accessible. It will be fluid. It will be available to users regardless of the type of device that they have or the input mechanism that they're using or whether they want to, need to access it through some sort of alternate device like a screen reader. Like, the web just works that way. So I also think that this concept of OneWeb is really powerful for the idea of what it means to maintain your website over time. So with this responsive OneWeb concept, you essentially have one set of content. So you maintain and manage one set of content that you are serving to everybody uniquely under the same URL. So you don't run into all of these problems that you have with fragmenting your URL structure so you can't share links around. You don't wind up with all of these problems of having to do user agent detection or device detection to try to figure out, where do you send things to. You maintain a single code base with a single release schedule, which means that your entire team can all be pointed in the same direction, rather than fragmenting your efforts across, a mobile website and a tablet website, a desktop website, and all of your app strategies. You have everybody pointed in the same direction. And that means that your website will probably be better and it'll be easier for people to manage. And this winds out to be borne out by some of the research and data that's out there. So Aberdeen last year did a study where they looked at 151 retailers and compared retailers that had responsive sites versus retailers that didn't have responsive sites. And they found out that on every single metric studied, that the responsive sites performed better. So they had higher brand awareness, they had higher revenue, they had higher conversion rates, they had a higher engagement rate, and the average order value was higher. So if I were a CEO working in the retail industry and questioning whether my strategy should be to build a responsive site or perhaps to build a separate mobile website or invest more in an app, I would be looking really carefully at the kind of data that suggests that responsive sites actually perform better. So when I say this, I'm waiting for everybody to just be like, great, okay, fantastic. We should just serve the same stuff to everybody on every device and we'll make it responsive and then we never have to think about this problem again. And I wish that it were true. I have never met an organization that, even if they are bought in on the concept of going responsive, does not find themselves saying essentially this: well, I need more than a responsive site. I need it to be adaptive. So there's this sense that people have that, well, the idea that I'm going to serve the same information, the same content, the same services, the same functionality to every user regardless of device it's too simple, right? Well, we can't just get away with doing that. So let me spend a little bit of time, because I think this is kind of gets to the crux of what I mean when I talk about mobile content strategy, of what do we talk about when we talk about adaptive. Like, when people say, I need more than a responsive site, I need it to be adaptive, what are they actually getting at? So one of my favorite things right now is I have Google Alerts set up for responsive design or responsive web design. And so my favorite hate reads of the moment are articles that are like, okay, well, no, you need to go beyond responsive design and really optimize your website for mobile users. Here's how you're going to move beyond responsive design, the web forward. Let's go beyond responsive design and discover context first. Let's move beyond the responsive web to the adaptive web. This guy thinks that we should move beyond responsive and adaptive to something he calls adjustive web design. I don't know what this guy's talking about. So when people say this, and you read these articles, the reason that these are like my favorite hate reads is that they will go in and in the essence they will say, hey, look, we found a borked responsive website out there. This responsive website isn't doing what we want it to do. You should use adaptive. And when they describe what adaptive does, it is essentially akin to magic. It's this idea that, yes, well, you're going to use this thing called adaptive, and then magically, every user is going to get exactly what they want whenever they want it. And unfortunately, given what I know about adaptive solutions, I don't actually believe that they are magic. I believe that they are more complex, more costly, more difficult to implement. And while I do certainly believe that there is a role for adaptive solutions as we figure out how we're going to serve things onto the mobile web, I don't believe that they are an easier or a better solution. I believe that they are just signing up for a different set of problems. So let's talk through when people talk about adaptive, what are they actually talking about? I think part of the problem where people can equate adaptive to magic, or part of the problem where when people sit around in a meeting and say, I need something more than responsive, I need it to be adaptive, is that people actually don't have a clear-cut industry standard definition of what adaptive means. I think it tends to mean two different things. And the first one I would call adaptive layouts. So in that, what I mean is device-specific layouts that can be aimed at a particular page or a particular feature that is targeted to a particular device class. It also usually, and I say usually, requires device detection and unique HTML to serve that device. And I say usually because there's some things that can be done entirely client-side, but in general, it's something where you're going to be serving different HTML based toward the device. Gets better. There's also adaptive content. And what that means is that you are serving structured content. You have taken your content and you have stored it at a finer grain of granularity. You are not just dumping everything into one big blob of a field, but you have chunked it out in a way that you can then target it according to a device type, but also to the user's context, or you can personalize that content based on criteria or characteristics that you know about who the person is. So if I had to sum this up simply, adaptive means serving something different, okay? Where responsive sort of embraces this idea that you should just serve the same stuff, the same website, the same content to everybody. Adaptive is the magical solution that enables people to serve something different. And as much as I might wish that we could all just happily embrace the one web concept and never think about device-specific targeting or never think about contextual targeting, the fact is that there are lots of scenarios where people actually do have a realistic need to do device-specific or contextual targeting. And I often say it's like, even if responsive will solve for 95% of your problems, and I genuinely do believe it will solve for 95% of your problems, 95% of the time, just serve the same stuff to everybody. But that means you've still got those 5% of problems that you might have to solve. So let's talk about what some of those things are. So in these three different models here, first question that I might ask is, are you serving everything into the same URL? So in a responsive solution, the answer is obviously yes, you have one URL. In an adaptive solution, you are also serving everything into the same URL, which means that you sidestep some of the problems that you have with an MDOT solution, where you have different URL strategies, you have a different subdomain. So what this gets at is that adaptive, in my mind, is often used as a synonym for what Google calls dynamic serving. Luke Wroblewski coined the term RESS, which stands for responsive and something, something, server, something. What it means is that you are getting the server involved to serve different information, but you're serving it into the same URL. So I like this example here. Responsive design is client-side. So that means that the entire page is delivered to the device browser, to the client, and then the browser changes how the page appears in relation to the dimensions of the browser window. Adaptive design is server-side, which means that before the page is even delivered, the server detects the attributes of the device and loads a version of the page or loads a version of the content that is optimized for the device, for its dimensions, and for its native features. Now, eagle-eye readers among us will note that I got this definition from the Huffington Post, which is my primary source of information and news about the web. Ethan loves it when I use this example. But no, I think if I wanted to have one really clear-cut, solid way of explaining what the difference between responsive and adaptive is, I would go with the client-side, server-side distinction. So responsive design is entirely client-side. What you show to the user is entirely handled client-side by the browser. Adaptive design or adaptive content requires that the server get involved. It requires that you have the goal of serving something different in some capacity. Now, I think it's important here to note that responsive design is Google's recommended approach for serving mobile websites. Now, why is that? Well, I will tell you, because there is no organization on the face of this earth that is more invested in you serving the same stuff to the same person under the same URL than Google is. Now, that's not to say, Google does not penalize companies that use a separate mobile website, an MDOT solution. Google does not penalize people for using adaptive design or dynamic serving. I actually just saw a study that came out yesterday that actually looked at some data about that to look at Google's ranking algorithm and say, are they actually, when they say they prefer responsive design, does that mean that they rank responsive designs higher? Or are they sort of agnostic as to how you solve for particular mobile problems? And in fact, they are agnostic. However, this is what they like you to do. And the reason that they like you to do that is because they want you to serve the same stuff to the same URL. It makes their life so much easier if the only thing that they have to do is crawl one URL. So, cover the URL question. Let's move on to this next question, which is, are you serving the same HTML? So, as you might guess, in a responsive solution, you're going to serve the same HTML to everybody. In an adaptive solution, you are not. And predictably, in an MDOT solution, you are also not. An adaptive solution will allow you to serve different HTML to different device classes. And this sits firmly or shakily on a foundation of device detection. So in order to do this, if you want to say, hey, I want to serve something different, I want to serve different HTML to a different device based on what I know about it, you're going to have to also get the server involved to be like, hey, device, what are you? Tell me what you are so I can make guesses about what I should send you. So I will not get into the nuts and bolts of why that may be a risky or somewhat risky decision. Let me spend a little bit of time, though, talking about why it is that somebody might want to do this. So the first thing that somebody might want to do is serve a different page. I worked with a university a while back that had just done a full redesign of their desktop website. And they came to me and they said, Karen, okay, now that we're done with this, can you consult with us on what we should do on mobile? And I said, you should build a time machine and go back in time and not have done that. That proved infeasible. So I went and did an audit of their desktop site, and I came back and I said, hey, you know what I think you can do? I think you can just do a responsive retrofit. So I think you can just go in and recode the front end to make it responsive, add in some media queries. It's not going to be perfect, but given that you just went through this whole massive desktop redesign, and given that everything is actually pretty clean and tidy at this point, doing that isn't going to be as painful as other options. And it was like this chill came over the room. I mean, you just see the icy stares, and everybody's kind of looking at me, and they're like, no, never, no, can't do it, no. And I'm like, why? I'm dragging the browser window closed in the meeting. I'm like, no, you could totally just squish this down. And finally, they were like, Karen, you obviously don't understand how political our homepage is. And I'm like, try me. And they said, well, if we go responsive, can we serve a different homepage? I'm like, of course you can. It's computers. You can do whatever you want. Do you think Ethan Marcotte's going to come over to your house in the middle of the night and yell at you for being a traitor to the cause if you serve a different homepage? If literally the only thing standing in your way of going responsive is that you think that the homepage is just going to be way too complex of a political battle if like all your stakeholders are going to sit there fighting over, how do you relay out this homepage and whose thing gets to be above who else, the other person, and you want to actually just design that one thing as a separate, unique, one-off experience. Why would you sign yourself up to serve every other page on your website as its own unique MDOT when you could just do that one page? I mean, like that just seems like, duh, let's stop talking about this and move on. So I don't even want to make it sound like a cop-out. So no less than Chris Coyier. So I'm sure you know Chris Coyier. He does CodePen and CSS tricks. So he said that when they were looking at how they were going to solve for CodePen, he said they actually found that it made sense in some cases to mix responsive design with separate mobile templates. And honestly, like if there's anybody out there who could probably ninja their way through doing a responsive design for every page on their site, it's Chris Coyier. But what they concluded was that there were some types of pages that were just like super easy, super obvious, no reason not to do them responsively. And they said there were some pages where it was like the layout just never felt right. Like they felt like the smartphone view or the desktop view was always going to feel kind of compromised. And sure, could they have put the effort in during the design and the development process to get it right? Absolutely they could have. But sometimes it comes down to a trade-off of, do you put that effort in design and development, or do you put that effort in longer-term maintenance? And so sometimes you might say, I will sign myself up to maintain 2 different versions of this page over the long term, because it might wind up being easier to do that than it would be to actually do that page responsively to begin with. I got into a fight on the internet with this guy this last week. Because this is one of my articles about, look at this borked responsive experience, you should go adaptive. And what he came back and said is, he's like, look, if you are a campaign marketer and you want to have a mobile landing page, like you genuinely, for whatever marketing goals you have, you want to serve a landing page from a campaign that is specifically aimed at mobile users on mobile devices. Like you have ads that you want to be served to mobile users, and then when they come off of those ads, you want to take them to a landing page that is optimized for someone on a mobile device, or has a coupon or a specific marketing message, or you want to A/B test specific marketing messages that are aimed at mobile users. He said it's so much easier if you serve that page adaptively. Like trying to manage all of those variations and trying to manage all of the different A/B tests across different devices and platforms across those pages, he's like, you are just signing yourselves up for like a nightmare. It's better to just cut a separate version of that page and serve it adaptively. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Like, I don't necessarily believe that we can't do these things responsively, but I think that there is an argument to be made for, hey, let's find things to do that are the simplest possible way to get something up quickly. In some cases, that's going to be serving a page adaptively. But even more than that, it's not necessarily that somebody needs to get to the level of serving an entirely separate page. In some cases, organizations find that all they want to do is serve just one little tiny thing differently. So Fidelity, if you do any work with financial services, the big problem is tables. It's always tables. And so Fidelity, when they were working through their account section, they said they found that they had a particular table, like a funds table basically, that they were really struggling with on smartphone, on smaller screens and larger screens. They said that there was kind of an industry standard sort order for the columns. And so they wanted to organize everything in the industry standard way. But what they found was that on smartphone views, that meant that some of the columns weren't visible. So they rearranged the columns so that the people on smaller screens would get to see the most important columns in their more constrained view. But what that meant was then, at larger breakpoints, on larger screens, the columns were out of order. And they were really struggling with, they said, we genuinely felt like we either were going to compromise the smartphone view or we were going to compromise the desktop view. And there wasn't a good way for us to negotiate between them. So they said, we just cut 2 different versions of this table. We just had a smartphone table and a desktop table, and we dynamically served not even the entire page, just that one little bit. my friend Stephen Turbeck heads their UX group there, and he actually called me up to discuss this with me, and he's like, yeah, Karen, we're actually exploring some adaptive solutions. And given that he's in financial services, I thought he was going to be talking about, like, oh yeah, we have to serve a completely different transaction flow. Like the whole screen has to be different, the whole series of screens has to be different, so we can support smaller devices. And he was like, oh no, it's nothing like that. Like, responsive works for virtually everything. It's just these little micro tiny bits of things that sometimes want to be different. Beatport. So Beatport is it's sort of like the Billboard charts and music discovery service for DJs. It's actually the largest electronic dance music property on the web. And when they rebuilt their application, they went entirely responsive, but they said, we actually serve just the player adaptively. And they said, we ran into that exact same problem, which was that for us to be able to negotiate through like how that player would get laid out on smaller screens and larger screens, I said it just made sense for us to be able to make that the way that we wanted it to be, rather than trying to handle everything responsibly. Now, if Ethan were here, he would be like, I'm gonna let you finish, but we need to talk about conditional loading. So my sense is that when I hear about a lot of these adaptive solutions, when I hear about people struggling with how do they wrangle through a complex page, or when I look at like the Beatport player and the different objects that they want to load, to lay out something that will have more stuff at larger breakpoints, what they're not recognizing is that a lot of that can also be done client-side. That they are getting the server involved to dynamically serve different versions of something, when what they could be doing is actually conditionally loading on the client side to essentially like progressively enhance the content or the functionality. So this is a really simple example of the Guardian doing this. So if you look at a module like this here, where there's like a block that has 2 images, and then this block has no images. And as you progressively enhance up to a larger breakpoint, there's images for every story. Same deal here, whereas in something like this, there's no images, and then as they go to a larger breakpoint, there are images. So that's all handled client-side. And to me, I think that's a great example of if you have your content stored at a level of granularity, and you have a publishing system that will support you in doing this, like this is, for many content management systems, this is a non-trivial task to be able to do, but it is possible to identify a set of content, identify the minimum viable set of content that you need to deliver to the smallest possible devices or in the least capable scenarios, and then layer that up as you get to larger breakpoints or as you get to larger screen sizes or more capable devices. That does not necessarily require you to get the server involved. Okay, so that's confusing, right? You want to know what else is confusing? That in some cases, the way that people describe adaptive solutions uses the same HTML. Oh, God. It's like, no wonder this is so confusing, right? So in an adaptive solution, or one of the more commonly used ways that people describe adaptive layouts or adaptive designs, is that while a responsive design is completely fluid, an adaptive design has device-specific layouts, okay? So adaptive designs snap into place at particular breakpoints. They snap into place at particular sizes. Here's a little animation that would show how that works. So rather than having something that is completely fluid to serve every type of device, in an adaptive design, designers are essentially aiming their design process at a particular size or a particular breakpoint. So it will snap into place at usually what winds up being a series of fixed width static sizes. They might look at their iOS devices or look at what they imagine to be the most common sizes for particular device types and use those designs to kind of snap into place. I saw an article that came out on Medium recently that proposed an adaptive design layout tool that would have fixed width screen sizes for iPhone 5, iPhone 6, iPhone 6 Plus, portrait and landscape, and then would be able to show a designer, like, here's how your design will work at these particular sizes. So my sense is that this way lies madness. Or if you are literally only designing native iOS apps, something like this might work. But if you're trying to support the mobile web, the idea that adaptive designs are too limiting because they're aimed at a fixed screen size that isn't the likely size someone will have, you really probably just want everything to be kind of fluid. So the real trick with adaptive, I think where this really starts to be something that we want to unpack, is this question of, are you serving the same content, okay? I will say, I genuinely believe that for the design problems, you are better off handling everything you can fluidly on the client side. That for a lot of the situations that I've outlined where people said, hey, what if we just serve some different HTML to different device types and called it a day? I tend to think that organizations, even if they think that that's a better solution in the short term, will wind up regretting those decisions over time. However, when I talk about adaptive solutions where I'm like, oh yeah, I see why you want to do that, it's generally that they want to serve different content. So in a responsive solution, other than with the little bit of conditional loading that I just talked about, you're going to be serving the same content to everybody. In adaptive content, you will not. And I guess presumably in an M.dot site, you're also serving different content, but let's move on. So the fixation that a lot of companies have on adaptive content is something that I've become kind of frustrated with over the last few years, because it seems like organizations have latched onto this concept of adaptive content as their way of being able to magically meet the needs of every user in every context on every device. And when I look at my frustration for adaptive content being kind of a buzzword, I feel that I have literally only myself to blame. I have been talking about adaptive content for the last several years. I think I popularized the term. And when I started talking about this, what I wanted to explain to people when I did this talk was this idea best illustrated by NPR in their case study called COPE. So I think a lot of people who have heard this case study by now. COPE stands for Create Once, Publish Everywhere. And what it means is that NPR has a publishing framework that allows them to store more granular content that is essentially served up via an API. So the content is separated from the presentation. The content is stored at a more granular level. And I love this case study, right? I love talking about this case study because from my perspective, it gets at an idea that is so near and dear to my heart, which is this idea that on the web, we too often treat content as if it is just one big blob of a thing, and it's so tightly intertwined with the design and the publishing system that it's almost impossible to separate content from form. When you look at, say, a wiki page, remember the wiki craze? Or my dear friends at WordPress, so I always make fun of WordPress. I like WordPress a lot, I use it myself. However, WordPress is sort of like the proto-blob CMS. It's like they gave you a title and a big blob of a field, and they told you to just dump everything you wanted in there. And it makes it very difficult when you want to then get more granular access to that content, when you want to be able to pull something out at a different level and send it someplace else. And so my enthusiasm, an enthusiasm that I've been promoting for the last 15 years and probably will promote until I die, is this idea that content needs to be stored in a more chunky way. You need to have more granular content that is fielded out, that has targeting capabilities attached to it so that you can do more with it. So this NPR example, I think, is a great case study of them being able to take a single story. So let's say they have this one article here, and they've got a title, and a teaser, and an audio file, and the body text of the article, and some images. And on their website, they can say, yeah, you know what I want? Give me the title and the audio file and one big image and the body text. But then on their player, they can be like, oh, I don't need all that garbage. No. Just give me the title and the teaser and the audio file. I don't need any images or the text of the article. I'm a player. I don't need that. On their mobile website, they could say, oh, yeah, give me just one small image, and I don't need the teaser either. They can dynamically send this content to apps. So this is a user-generated app that's pulling from their API. They can even have their content show up in the desktop application of iTunes, which frankly is just showing off. And so when you look at an example like this, it is super, super easy to see now in hindsight that this has become the poster child for device-specific content targeting. people use this as their case study for saying, oh, if you want to send different content to different device types, this is how you do it. I have some concerns about this. I'm not actually super enthusiastic about the idea that we want to serve different content to different devices. And I think possibly the best example, or the best case study that I can give for why there are limitations to this approach is, oh, hey, guess who just went responsive? Oh, it's NPR. They said, yeah, we had a phone website and a tablet website and a desktop website, and we really only maintained the desktop website because we just didn't have enough resources to cover all of those fronts. It just wasn't a tenable situation. Okay? So even though they had the infrastructure to be able to dynamically serve and target content to a variety of different device types and device classes, they found that even though they could do that on the back end, it wasn't worth maintaining 3 different versions of their website on the front end. They were much better off having a responsive strategy that would simply serve the same content and information to everybody. Now, I will say, they still do device-specific strategies for native apps. And I will also say that if you look at the conditional loading example that I talked through earlier, they have the level of granularity in their publishing system that would enable them to do the kind of conditional loading. I think a lot of the goals that I outlined for being able to serve different bits of content to different platforms, even though they could handle that server side and have separate separate sites or separate platforms on the front end, they could also do some of that conditionally because they have a publishing system that supports that. So I think that's great. But I also want to say there are still plenty of scenarios in which this kind of device-specific targeting might be of use. So I teach at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, and they have a responsive website, they have a native app, and they also have these digital signs that they bought to put up all over campus. And I like this example because it's really clear to me. I can just look at this screen and say, if they didn't have their content stored in a granular way, like if their desktop website or if their website was just being published all out of WordPress, they wouldn't be able to target all of the different bits of information that they would need to target to get them to render appropriately on that screen. What they need is the ability to pull out the title and the image and the overview and the date and the time, all of those as separate granular fields, so that they can then publish those to those screens and have them styled and formatted differently. So I think, and I will say this until I die, the benefits of having more granular content are something that I'm like, you need this, you want this. Even if you're not explicitly going to do device-specific targeting on the web, you still want your content structured and stored in this fashion because it's more flexible, it's easier to maintain. If you have to send it out for translation, it reduces your translation costs. There's just a huge amount of benefit to thinking about your content in this way. That said, I think most people, when I get all excited about modular content, aren't doing it because they want modular content. Most people, when I talk about this, are doing it because they want to target their content, okay? What they want to do is they want to have little bits of content that then they can create variations, alternate forms of that content that they can target to people based on some known characteristics. So I want you all to know that everything that I know about adaptive content on the web, I based this understanding on what I know about being the only person at my job in the 90s who knew how to do a mail merge. And I had to do it using WordPerfect for DOS, and so all of you kids and your graphical user interfaces can suck it. So in essence, when you talk about adaptive content on the web, we are literally talking about a glorified mail merge, okay? You are talking about the idea that you have a set of content that is stored in a database, that it has some fielded characteristics against it, and then you are dynamically serving up these little bits of content or these variations of content based on some known characteristics about the user. So let's talk about what some of those characteristics might be. So the first one, the one that everybody keeps talking about, is device, okay? You want to be able to target information to somebody differently based on whether they have a smartphone or a tablet or a desktop or whatever. The second is what I like to call context. And then the third is what I would call personalization, like targeting things to the actual person. So if you talk about targeting something to the device, That may mean, as most people think, is mobile, tablet, or desktop. But it might also mean that you want to target information based on the OS. It might mean that you want to target different content based on the capabilities of that device. So, what do you know about, I don't know, like the screen size or the input mechanism or whatnot? When you talk about context, this might mean what are the contextual cues that you can pick up from the user or from their device, typically from the sensors that you could get off of that device. So do you want to serve information based on time of day? Do you want to serve information based on the location that the user is in? Other weird things that you might not think about. Do you want to serve information based on the velocity that the device is going, the humidity in the room, the temperature in the room? You may not think about doing that for the mobile web, but if you're in a healthcare context or some other context, a factory setting, perhaps those are things where you would want to serve content adaptively based on that known context. And then when you're thinking about serving content to the person, that's literally thinking, what do you know about that actual user? And you might realize that this starts to get, inaccurate or troubling in many ways. But if you're the kind of person, if you're a marketer that might want to say, hey, I would like to target information differently based on someone's age or based on their life stage. So I'm a bank, and I want to serve different marketing messages to a college student who's just starting out versus a retiree who's, ending their, wrapping up their financial life. Or maybe I want to target different information based on somebody's gender or their race. Wouldn't that be a great idea? Or the language that they speak, or what I know about their relationships. Are they married? Are they about to have a baby? Like, all of this is handled through some sort of dynamic personalization that's adaptive content. So let's talk through some examples of what this might be. So when you talk about serving information to the device, so I feel like I've covered this pretty extensively right now, but I want to say that it really isn't just about serving information to mobile, tablet, or desktop differently. Right now, today, Orbitz is dynamically serving different search results to users based on their OS. So they found out that Mac users were more likely to buy more expensive hotels. And so if they can sniff your OS from your browsing history, they will show more expensive hotels higher up in the search results. So I think this is an example of, it's like the content stays the same, but the priority of the content is different based on what they can glean about your device or your device class. So I hope it's clear by now that I think that the need to serve different content to different, literally physically to different devices is a little bit of a red herring. So in many cases, when I describe perhaps wanting to serve a shorter form of a headline to a quote-unquote mobile device and a longer form of a headline to a quote-unquote desktop device, you don't actually need to do device detection to find that out. You can just base that on the size of the screen and conditionally load that or do some kind of detection that isn't necessarily about the device itself, but rather actually based physically on the layout of the screen. But I do want to say, there are scenarios under which you might actually want to target different information to the device. Like, let's say you're AT&T. So AT&T went all in on their native app strategy. And went out, because they were like, hey, we're AT&T, we sell phones, we should build apps for phones. And they ran into a little problem, which was that when people called up their customer service line, the customer service rep couldn't help them with their account because the rep had no idea what that person was looking at. Like, they couldn't tell them where to go or what to click on or what to look for, because the functionality and the layout across all of those different apps in their desktop experience was so different that they didn't know what to do. So AT&T said, we've got to pull back from this native app device-specific strategy, and instead we're going to go responsive. We're going to build one responsive framework that will serve all of our account servicing and support content, and then we'll package those up as faux native apps so that someone can download it from the App Store. But it's essentially we're going to maintain one responsive code base for all of our account servicing. Hooray, right? Yeah, that's great. But they still need to serve adaptive content. Why? Because the content is literally device-specific. Like, they actually genuinely have to serve device-specific content, because if someone's coming in looking for support on their iOS device, they want to serve them only iOS content. And they could perhaps manually ask someone to select which type of device they have when they go in for support content, but that's dumb, right? Like, I find AT&T rather frustrating to begin with, but I would be even more frustrated with them if I went to their support site and they were like, hey, what type of device do you have? I'd be like, you know that, don't you? Isn't that the only thing you know about me? So for them, even if they want to be completely responsive on the front end, they are still going to be serving device-specific adaptive content on the back end that's going to be targeted to particular devices or device classes. So even if you think that device-specific content is something that might be necessary, one of the things that I found from my research is that it simply turns out not to be true. Chris Bolt from Microsoft said that our data shows us quite plainly and clearly that the behavior of people on mobile devices is really not that different from the behavior of people on desktop. The things that they're looking to do and the tasks that they're seeking to accomplish are really quite the same. So other than in the limited scenarios under which people do genuinely need device-specific content, I think that the idea that users on mobile devices have wildly different behaviors or completely different tasks than people on other devices just simply isn't true. And so I think that, in my mind, the need for device-specific adaptive content is really quite overblown. In general, people are better off backing out of that device-specific conversation, serve everything responsibly, serve the same content to everybody. And then, if you think you need to serve something different to somebody, base those decisions on something that is more accurate than device class. Namely, based on what you can know about the user's context. So I will remind you again that the types of things that somebody might look for as contextual cues are things like time or location or velocity or humidity or temperature. Now you might think, like, wow, these are some strange examples here. And I have a fantastic example that I can give of device-specific contextual targeting. So I just got these fancy new hearing aids. I've worn hearing aids for 35 years, and these new models out on the market now are completely iPhone integrated. And so if you know anything about how digital hearing aids work, what they have is they have a set of different programs. So you can have a restaurant program, or I have an auditorium program. And one of the programs that they have is car. So if you are in a car, they will automatically switch over to the car program, and that will essentially, it's like a Bluetooth headset, only it's your hearing aids. How do they know when you're in a car? Well, they look at the velocity of the device. They say, when the iPhone, they're monitoring your speed, and when the velocity that the device is going is more than 10 miles an hour, they will switch over to the car program. Fascinating, right? I love this example because it says, right, what can we know from the sensors of the device that might tell us some information? And I hope it's also clear what the risk of thinking this way is. So sure, if I'm going more than 10 miles an hour, I might be in a car, but I could be riding a bike. I could be running. I could be a human cannonball. The human cannonball is probably the most likely of those options as far as I'm concerned, but the idea that there are ways in which I might be traveling more than 10 miles an hour that aren't in a car is, it's like the contextual cues that you can pull from the sensors of the device are always an inadequate proxy for what the user's actual context is. I had somebody, when I first gave this talk, or first started talking through these examples, come to me and say, well, Karen, these things that you're talking about as context, they're not really context. Like, standing in line is a context. And I'm like, well, you have no way of knowing if the user's standing in line. All you can get at are the contextual cues, these device context proxies that you can get from the sensors. And they will always be a somewhat inadequate proxy for what the user's actually doing. The best example of something not being that way, though, is location. So in many situations, when people talk about wanting to do device-specific context, when they talk about wanting to capture mobile users who are on the go, they are talking about targeting information to a device, like saying, oh, well, smartphone users are on the go, when in fact, what they really want to do is target information based on location. They want to be able to know, oh, where is that user physically in space? So here's a very straightforward example of like a restaurant guide for a city in Leeds. And what this will do is pull location-specific restaurant recommendations for people. So rather than producing a list of editors' picks or whatever, they basically say, we will use the GPS on your phone, pull in this location-specific information, and you will get restaurant recommendations that are tailored, so that if you're standing here and you don't know where to go eat, we will show you where the closest ones are. That, to me, strikes me as a perfectly reasonable example of how somebody might want to use adaptive content. I'm just like, yep, okay. As long as everybody's thinking about using the most accurate proxy we have for where the user is, rather than relying on device-specific targeting to say, oh, if a mobile user or something, we should do this for mobile users. Because the truth is, people who are on desktop computers might also benefit from location-specific targeting. So here's an example of a story from the New York Times where they actually did a little bit of location targeting. So it's a story about income inequality. And what they did is they looked at where you were, and I was looking at this on my desktop, and made a guess about where you were reading the article. So they're like, okay, we're going to show you, default to the data for Manhattan, because that's our best guess for where you're reading this, and then you can manually select another location if you want to look someplace else or whatever. So too often I see people look at examples where they say, people use different devices at different times of day. People typically use their smartphones in the morning as they're on their commute. They use their tablets much more at night. And they use this as evidence for a need for a device-specific strategy. I don't see that at all. What I see is you have a time of day specific strategy where you might want to be targeting different information based on, is somebody reading it in the morning or at night? But to then sign yourself up to maintain multiple versions of a website or maintain multiple platforms so that you can attract this quote-unquote tablet user at night doesn't make sense. Like, why not just have the same website and then have an editorial strategy that publishes different types of information in the evening so that you can capture people wherever they might happen to be reading it, possibly on their tablet, but maybe also on their phone. So the message here that I will leave you with is don't use device as a proxy for context, okay? In virtually every scenario, if you are trying to target information through time or location or some other contextual variable where you want to guess what somebody wants, device is always going to be the least accurate way to do that. A much better way to do that is to try to get a little bit closer to where the user's at based on the time of day or their location or some other information that you can glean from those sensors.
Thanks for watching the Build Right Maker Series. Check out our other videos from industry leaders at buildright.io. Or even better, buy a ticket and attend in person.